and then we'll see how that goes. It's going to be somewhat related to last week, of course, but we'll get into that in a moment after we stop for a second to have a quick word of prayer here before we begin. So if you'd pray with me, please. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We are grateful to you for all the things that you have done, everything that you continue to do. We thank you for this time and this opportunity that we have to look into your word, to read from it. We ask that you would bless us as we study and think about it and discuss it, that we may better understand it and you and your will for our lives, that we may serve you better. We are thankful for the vects of your revelation, and we are most grateful, Father, that you sent your living word, your Son, to this earth to be a lesson, to be an example, and, Father, most crucially, a sacrifice on our behalf to redeem us. We pray all these things in your Son's name. All right, so Psalm 10, which, as we discussed a little bit last week, depending on how you cut this up and parse this and which original source you use, could be considered, in a sense, Psalm 9b. They are connected, and they were thought to be originally the same psalm that has been, for whatever reason, practical, theological, some reason, separated into two separate psalms within the text. They form together, as we talked about, a kind of acrostic poem, which is a thing that you see several times through the Psalms, where succeeding lines will begin with a new letter of the Hebrew alphabet, so that as you go through, you have a series of lines that work their way through the Hebrew alphabet as the initial letter in each case. Now, that is, of course, in translating to English, impossible to truly replicate in a way that presents that. So you kind of have to either just know Hebrew, which I do not, or be able to just bear that fact in mind as you go through rather than seeing it on the page. We talked in the very first class of Psalms about there are other languages that have done similar sorts of things that use a form of alliteration as a way, as a poetic method. Notably and more closely to English, the Anglo-Saxons did this, and you'll see this actually in the poem of Beowulf, the telling of Beowulf, where the initial letters will be put together in order to form an alliterative sound that creates a poetic feeling, creates that rhythm within the mind of the hearer or the speaker in order to make it a different way of speaking than just simply the normal everyday prose that we would speak. So, we'll go ahead and read Psalm 10. It is about the same length as Psalm 9, so together they would have made a fairly lengthy poem. Thank you for advancing that. I should have tested this here. We can do that, turn it on, we'll back up one, move forward one. Yep, it works. Okay, so we'll read through that, and then we'll go ahead and discuss parts of it. Why do you stand afar off, O Yahweh? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In pride, the wicked hotly pursues the poor. Let them be taken in the devices that they have conceived. For the wicked boasts of his heart's desire, and the covetous renounces, yea, contemns Yahweh. The wicked in the height of his wrath does not seek. There is no God, is all his devices. His ways are firm at all times. His judgments are far above your judgments, are far above out of his sight. As for all his foes, he puffs at them. He says in his heart, I shall not be moved. To all generations I shall not be in adversity. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue are mischief and iniquity. He sits in the lurking places of the villages. In the secret places he murders the innocent. His eyes watch secretly for the helpless. He lurks in secret as a lion in his covert. He lies in wait to catch the poor. Catches the poor when he draws him in his net. He crouches, he bows down, and the helpless fall by his strong ones. He says in his heart, God has forgotten. He hides his face. He will never see it. Arise, O Yahweh. O God, lift up your hand. Forget not the poor. Why does the wicked contemn God and say in his heart, you will not require it? You have seen, for you yourself behold mischief and spite to requite it with your hand. The helpless commits himself to you. You have been the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked, and as for the evil man, seek out his wickedness. Shall you not find it? Yahweh is king forever and ever. The nations have perished out of his land. You have heard the desire of the meek, O Yahweh. You will prepare their heart. You will cause your ear to hear, to judge the fatherless and the oppressed, that man who is of the earth may cause dread no more. All right, so if we understand the context of this, that this was at one time probably much more closely linked to Psalm 9, that they were possibly, and in fact maybe we could say probably the same psalm with two portions that have been divided apart. How does 10 differ from 9? And why would they have been separated? We talked, of course, about their separation, what the connections were last week, but thinking about it again or coming back to the same question, what is the difference between them, and why would you potentially want to divide them from one another? I understand that this is speculative. None of us can actually know for sure. We don't have it written down. I want to be clear that we're not going to arrive at the definitive answer of why they were divided. No. But what potentially? Possibly. Yeah. Yeah, he certainly begins 9 differently than he begins 10. There is a stark contrast between the way each of them opens. Wayne, you were going to...
9 talks a lot about the control that God has.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That we look to work, thanks and all of that to him, because we know that he's got it all. We know how to take care of it. We got a problem. Now he's showing our problem.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, sir.
In 9, he talks about the introspection. The writer is saying, this is who my relationship is with God. In 10, he talks about the rest of the world, the world's relationship with God, and contrast in those two, kind of a big contrast. I'm not perfect, but I have a relationship. I'm trying to serve God. In 10, it's the earth, the wicked, they're evil, they reject God, they don't even want to be part of you. Oh God, come and judge them.
Yeah, they feel almost different topically, whereas 9, and several people kind of talked about the beginning and the opening, and much of it is a confidence in who God is and what God will do, right? That he starts praising God, and then even after he shifts from exalting and extolling God partway through, he says things like, for example, in verse 10, verse 9, the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. So speaking even of those things that come to trouble the righteous, and specifically the psalmist, he's expressing that confidence in God of what God will do. And he continues on, right, 16 of Psalm 9, the Lord is known by his justice, the wicked are ensnared by the work of his hands. He's talking about what God does to the wicked and how God defends those that put their trust in him from the evil acts of the world around them. But in 10, it's a pivot, in a sense, to talking about what it is that the wicked people are doing. And then at the very end, it starts maybe in 12, but it really gets going probably in 14 and so forth. There is the request to God to do the things that have been talked about already in Psalm 9. Or again, if we were to think of this as a single long psalm, the things that were talked about way back at the beginning of the psalm. It has finally come full circle and returned to this confidence, right? Verse 17 of Psalm 10, you hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted, you encourage them, and you listen to their cry. Into 18, defending the fatherless and the oppressed in order that man who is of the earth may terrify no more. He's returned finally once again full circle to the place that he has begun. But if you were to look at these as being different topically. The place where they are split gives 9 that focus on what God does to defend the righteous, the people that he has chosen, and 10 is more fully a lament that they could give over the times and places and ways in which they have been and are being oppressed. And so if you wanted to have coherent seems like the wrong word, but a more concise pair of psalms talking about these two topics rather than having one very lengthy one. Again, remember the acrostic nature of the psalm running all the way through the alphabet. If we were to do something like that, I mean, that's 26 stanzas, one where each one begins with subsequent letters of the alphabet. You might feel that that was too lengthy, too unwieldy for use in its entirety sometimes. So there are a number of reasons that you could do this, both topically and then again, if it's very, very long. I mean, how often do we sing every single verse that's potentially there for every single song? Not always. Sometimes for length, for various other reasons, we prune, we pare down. Right? And that's perfectly fine and fair thing to do. Frequently as well, there are also songs that have more verses than get printed in songbooks. For space, for time, for, sometimes, I don't want to speak any names or call anybody's favorite song. I'm sure sometimes editors look at one and go, you know what? Of these 9 verses this guy wrote 500 years ago, those middle 3 are a little weaker than the rest. I think we can safely, leave them out. Not to say again that the Bible works the same way, not to impugn the divine nature of Scripture, but making that division allows you to use both halves in different contexts because of their different topical focus. So 9 begins with praise for God's actions and becomes a lament. 10 begins with lament before shifting. So this is something I mentioned a moment ago. It starts and it completes this circle or this cycle by returning back to the beginning of where 9 starts. Yeah?
It almost reminds me that Ken would be so let me show you what I'm talking about.
Okay, yeah.
From 9.
Mm-hmm.
Like shining a flashlight, on something that's a little shadow. Pretty specific.
Yeah, it gets into much more detail about what it is that the wicked, those that do evil, do. So let's take this question though, and if we're going to start Psalm 10 where it is, he starts with a pretty pointed question or pair of questions or set of questions. Why, O Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Why does God seem to be absent in our troubles?
His timeline is not our timeline.
Yeah, the time in which God does things or the order or the length of the way things are done is not, we're told this in different places in the Bible, that God does not operate in the way that we would or we would expect. Yes, sir?
And we can always come to him.
We can, which is what this psalm is in fact an example of, right? That this is going to God, bringing one's problems to him and asking for his intervention and his help. Yeah?
And we're always living within the problem or in the trouble, whereas God is above and outside of it. Just like people we have a relationship with, family or friends or best friend, who we would go and tell our troubles to and say, hey, what do you think? How should I handle this? He does not live in our thing, so his time to answer us or help us out isn't our timeline.
Yeah, not even just simply time, but his perspective on the world, is different from ours. And the way that he thinks about the things that occur is different from the way that we would think, right? That it says elsewhere in the Scripture that God's thoughts are unlike to our thoughts, that we cannot comprehend God in the way that he truly thinks about things. And it's almost, frankly, a little bit tautological, right? That circular kind of logic. God, if he is allowing these things to happen, if he is not directly intervening for us, of course we'll seem absent. It doesn't mean that he is is not caring or that he is not with us, that he does not provide some support, but while we struggle, when we have difficulty, God will necessarily feel more absent than when we feel him intervening for our behalf. He could not help but seem to be more absent to our senses when we are experiencing the predations of the wicked. Yeah.
And could we imagine a world where God acts for every person in the world to just, it would be total chaos. I mean, every second we would see something happening everywhere. It's just impossible. And yet, God, like a father, is looking at the long view, knowing where this is going. You're going through trouble, but it's to your benefit, to your growth, to your discipline, depending on what the situation is. And God's looking at that in the long term. You're going to grow because of this. I need you to be at this place because you have this. And in the long term, I'm going to take care of you, and it's going to work out.
There is certainly a difficulty in trying to conceive of a world where everyone gets what they want, right? The things that we desire for ourselves or we think that are going to be good for us, that we ask God for, are not always the case. And we can't always know that this is so, right? We want a particular job, and we do not get a particular job. That may be the beneficence, the grace of God, that we do not have that because we don't know where that will lead. Or how that could possibly be bad for us in the future. So we can't always see the beneficial things that God does on our behalf. But I think at the same time that we do need to be cautious about saying that all these things that occur redound to our benefit, or are done, maybe is a better way to say it. We need to be careful about saying they are done for our benefit. Because if we look at the case of Job, did what happened to Job happen for Job's benefit? Was it there to help him, make him better off in some material or spiritual way than he was before? I see one person shaking their head.
I think in his case, it was more everybody around him needed to be schooled, where he was in the right place the whole time and came through.
Indeed, that Job loses things that are materially beneficial, that Job was already noted as having faith in God that was unshakable. In fact, this is the condition that precipitates his misfortune. When we read the beginning of Job, it is Satan that comes into God's presence and asks, right, if he can have Job, right, and contends that after God says that Job is in fact an upright man, that if his things were taken away, if his benefits in his life were removed, that he would not be so faithful. And God, knowing that this is not the case, still allows this to happen. And it becomes a lesson for the people that know him, and a lesson for the people that read about him, and for all of us here. And we may benefit, but I don't think we can say that Job necessarily did. It would be presumptuous of me to say that Job had a stronger faith after this had occurred. Maybe he did. But if it was just the same as it was, being the most faithful and upright man on the face of the earth, right? If he's still just the man at the head of the pack, what did he gain? He lost all his possessions and all his children. Sometimes, I would argue, things happen to us because we can take it. And someone else needs to benefit who could not.
Well, I think that's totally true. Events can happen in your life, I know because we've experienced it, where down the road, that might happen to someone else, and you've been put in a position to be able to counsel them. I mean, serious stuff. And I think that James was right, that everybody around Job was schooled because of that. But Job got everything back.
He gets things back, but this is one of those interesting
I'm not
things.
saying that he was rewarded because he went to hell.
Well, right, but the brief point I would say is, though Job has more children, I don't think it indicates that his children were resurrected.
No, I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is, he wasn't left in a ditch
No.
when it was all over. God still was there for him at the end. Because he got scolded even during the whole thing when he got pretty frustrated, which all of us would, probably more frustrated. And he kind of challenged God, and God put him right in his place. So I think that we do, maybe God allows us to go through events in our life that can help others. And I think it's the same thing we're studying here.
Yeah.
God won't just strike somebody for cheating their neighbor. That, it's going to take another human or something to be involved.
Boy, maybe. I mean, we need to be careful about drawing those direct lines between someone's misfortune and their own sin, right? Jesus makes that clear in the Gospels when confronted with the man who was born blind, and he's given the question, all right, who sinned, right? Was it this man or was it his parents that he has to suffer this way? And he says, it's not necessarily either, right?
Well, I'm not saying that.
Right. So what I'm saying is that sometimes it can just be human misfortune. Sometimes it is necessary for us to do righteousness in the world, right? To justify and rectify some of these wrongs given positions that we have. But I think sometimes God does still, potentially, smite in some form or fashion those who do evil. We just have to be careful about being explicit when we draw those connections. It falls into that same realm of knowing the heart of the person you're dealing with. I can't know what misfortunes that befall someone could possibly have been divinely ordered, right? Either as punishment or correction, right? Discipline to bring them back to the righteous and narrow way, and which are simply time and chance happening to us all. But
But I think that we lose out in our prayers. We have an elder's prayer every week.
mhm.
And I think we're more excited about, could you pray for my sick mother,
Mhm.
than we are about praying for successes maybe Estella's had in music or whatever. I think that we really one-dimensionalize what we expect from God sometimes. And this is telling us that's, even though we think we might have it all figured out, we still got to ask for the help. We can't be in despair asking about it.
Sure. Yeah, it's easy to fall into a frame of reference or a frame of mind where we don't approach God with all the things we potentially could. Yeah, that's certainly the case, regardless of which particular thing you're keeping in or which ones you're leaving out. Yes, sir.
I think in the search to identify some kind of logic in these presentations of these scriptures we've just been focusing on, and to reconcile why good things and bad things happen in general, you have to look at the big picture of what's really going on in this entire creation and the fact that God put Satan down here, made him the prince of the earth. And the whole thing is really based on determining whether you're going to serve God or whether you're going to serve Satan. And in that process, there has to be many tests and many things go on that manifest what that condition is going to be. Are you going to be for God, follow him, or are you going to be for Satan? And Satan is here, and he's strong. He's the prince of the earth, and he can create all kinds of situations. He can create all kinds of bad things, and have them befall you. And so that's the case. And people say, why does God do this, and why does he do that? He's not doing that. He's put Satan there to let that test take place, because he wants people on their own free will to choose him, as opposed to being a bunch of case with Job, that's a special case. Satan and God were playing almost a game with him. He was the operative of the game that they were playing. What could happen there, that's another whole story. But he's different than the general case for the most part. They were actually at play with him. And so I think that the question of why this, why that, just comes exactly back to that. God doesn't bring these things on you necessarily. He lets them come from Satan. But one thing he does is he puts out his full armor there. And for those that realize that and know how to find it, how to put it on, he allows you to do battle with Satan. So I believe that from that perspective, you need to look at these kinds of things to come up with the answers.
Yeah, I mean, this is turning into more of a discussion on Job than I anticipated. But I wasn't necessarily prepared for that. But I take your point. I do think that the way that he starts in the very first verse of this psalm does take that kind of point of view a little bit into account, which he says, the question is not why has God done this to me? What the psalmist asks is, why are you not here protecting me? Why does it seem like you are far away from me and not helping me?
And that's where it's come from. You have to understand that in the beginning, he put Satan over here. And the answer to that question is, why are you not doing this? Well, maybe in the end he is, but these interim situations go on because of that dynamic with Satan there in the background. That kind of answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we could. I have thoughts, but I want to table and move on. I would really like to get out of verse 1 before the class ends and maybe move on to something else. But that is an excellent thing to consider and discuss. The next section here, he starts in verse 2 and he spends almost 12 verses. There's a little bit of a break here between 12 and 14 where he kind of goes back and forth as he begins his transition. But about 12 verses of the 18 in total talking about and expanding on the acts of the wicked. Why spend so much time? Okay, good. I've seen several people turn around. I was paranoid for a minute that it was not keeping up, that I was on 2 different slides. Okay, good, I'm good. But why do you spend so much time expanding and expounding on the various things that the wicked do? Is it not enough to just say the wicked do wicked things? Why, God, you let the wicked do wicked things? Instead of going through this litany of things that they do, right? That they hide, that they ensnare people, that they murder them, that they're always looking around, that they're really sneaky. Like he goes on and on and on. Yeah.
Just like the attorney arguing a case before a judge, he's enumerating all of these points to drive his case home.
Okay.
I think that's really the long and short of the answer to what you're asking.
Repetition certainly does aid in that kind of getting the point home. And again, listing them all out, you add the length of your list, in a sense, to the rest of the things individually. Yes, ma'am?
Setting it up for the request he has in verse 12.
Okay. Yeah. It lays the groundwork for what is going to come at the end, right? That when we get to the end in verses 12 and 13, and carrying on through 18, that the request then is within the context of the litany of things that have been suffered, the list of indignities. Yes, sir?
And it seems like he's building up here. He's like, this one, and this one, and this one. And like he's checking himself with God. I think these are wrong, and these should be, answered, and you should be punishing this guy for the first one. Here's the second one, and the third one, and am I right? Is the fourth one still wrong too? And it's almost like he's, having a conversation with God in his own mind, saying, I think these are all bad, and you should have got him on the first one, but here's a second, third, and fourth, and he just keeps growing that list. Then he gets to the end, and he says, and this guy thinks that nothing's going to happen to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly a strong theme of that, which if I end up with enough time, we'll get to that point very specifically. But there is the element of, as you say, of kind of presenting these to God, and that one might almost say a rhetorical use of, are not these things terrible things? Do you not, God, speak against these things? But in terms of that rhetoric as well, the poetic nature of this whole, two psalm or one psalm, depending on how you think about it, cycle, allows this to be balanced with the first half, or the psalm that comes before it, where you have virtually equal portions talking about the things that God does to defend his people, and the things that his people suffer and need God to defend them from. And it creates, as I kind of mentioned, this sort of circle thing where at the very end of 10, we return to the point that we have near the beginning of 9. That it creates a poetic balance between these two related concepts. That the wicked are in the world, that the wicked do evil things, that they oppress the people of God and the righteous and those that are defenseless, and that God exists, and God is going to be the defender of the helpless, that God is going to act on their behalf, and that there is a confidence that we can have that there will be justice for those that are righteous. Yeah?
I think the example of the poetic building of this song is something we need to be mindful as when reading the Bible is when you take an individual verse, it's easy to take out of context or say, oh, this verse is all this meaning. But sometimes, like here, those verses are there just to build up the song itself until you get into the main body. We can go through verse by verse by verse and say, what is the true meaning of this verse and this one? When in truth, it is just there as poetic license for a song.
Yeah, exactly. That there is both benefit at times in being narrowly focused on an individual tree, but equally so, and in a different sort of benefit, from stepping back to view the forest together, right? To see what that means in its context with everything else that surrounds it. Yeah, and that we can easily get caught up, probably we have a propensity more as humans, at least I and a lot of the people that I have heard speak, of focusing too tightly on that individual verse, on that individual concept within, say, a particular psalm, instead of viewing it as a coherent whole. Right? And this is a theme that I've rambled on about or returned to many, many times when talking about the epistles, particularly, that those were not broken into chapter and verse divisions when they were written. Right? That Paul writes a letter to the Corinthians or to the Romans. He expects them to read the whole thing, and it is a series of coherent and connected arguments driving his point home. And that when we study, right, the nature of our study breaks that into portions, but it is important to constantly remember, right, at various points to step back and see what the sweep of the argument is. And with the Psalms, it is much the same thing, right? That these Psalms were written to be, individual Psalms, a coherent set of thoughts on a particular theme that should be understood in its entirety, as well as parsing and understanding individual verses that may cause questions or be confusing to the modern mind or through translation. I don't want to cut anybody off, but I'm running a little short, so I'm going to skip ahead here. Verses 4, 11, and 13. What are these telling us about wicked acts, specifically?
Thinks that God doesn't care.
He thinks that God doesn't care. Yeah?
He thinks that God does not apply to him. God is something else. It's a concept, it's an idea, it's not real.
Right, that God is potentially not even there, right? There is an element of approaching atheism in those verses, right? It's a description of the wicked. This returns to the bringing up of Satan in the context of the world, that when we do what is wrong, we don't necessarily even have to explicitly, either with what we say or in our thoughts, decide that we are going to serve Him instead of God, we can partake in that same sin, which leads then to other wicked things, which is that we usurp or wish to usurp the role of God in deciding what is right and wrong for us to do without reference to others. That Satan had that sin of pride, of wishing to become as God was, wishing to do as he chose and pleased without reference to what God tells us we must do. And that when we forget God or ignore him or believe that he is not going to call us to account, we then commit the same sorts of sins, that we do what we want to our own benefit without regard to God or anyone else. That wicked acts stem from putting our will ahead of God's. Yeah.
And it's a substitution of morality. God's morality or God's will doesn't guide me anymore. God will not require it, he says.
Mm-hmm.
He's saying, I've decided what is good for me. I'm going to live the way I want to. I don't care what God, there is no God. You know, as far as I'm concerned, there is no God, there is no morality. It's only what I decide.
Yeah,
and that's where this person's getting.
It essentially becomes a rebellion. That I will do as I want. That I am now my own moral arbiter and authority. And it is the same whether you believe in the existence of God or not. Whether you believe God is there and you're just going to ignore him, or that you believe that God is not there and therefore there can be no constraint. They lead to these same places where we do as we please and we injure others because who is there to tell me what to do?
Who's going to stop it?
Right. Right.
Well,
Who
we
will
see
stop it?
that. I love that God created a family existence that we all participate in, raising our own kids. I always say the Old Testament was kind of like raising a teenager, and the New Testament was dealing with adults because of grace. It was more physical. He was more physically involved with his people. And when you're raised, if you've had kids, and I'm sure we all have, there is that 12 to 14-year-old rebellion time where you can't tell me what to do. They may not say that to your face, but they're saying it under their breath. And they'll go and get into some trouble. I mean, we see how God deals with us just being a father. Yourself, or mother, with your own kids.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a reason that the analogy of God as our Father, is so appropriate, right? That relationship of father to children, of parent to child, is, it's not one-to-one and it's not perfect. I am not God. I don't have that same control. But as an analogy, it covers and encompasses so much of what does this relationship mean, right? We do not always understand as children the things that our parents do that they ultimately intend to benefit us. In the same way, right, we look back to return to that first verse, we do not always understand why God does or does not do the things he does, but we can have that same confidence, in fact, more confidence in God doing and not doing things with the intent that we will end up having what is best. That he has our best interests in his mind. That he loves us and cares for us in ways that no one else can or would. The last thing that I think this is the last thing that I had on here because I'm running up against time. Very quickly, what is the connection between the fatherless and the poor and the oppressed? This appears a couple times. Verse 18, but there's another one, verse 14. Specifically, I'm thinking of the fatherless here. How are the fatherless like the poor and the oppressed?
The fatherless breadwinner, if he's gone, you're poor.
Okay. Certainly, yeah, without someone who is there earning, right? You're poor. But we've undermine that to a degree in our certain society, but I would argue that the analogy still works, regardless of your governmental system and what you like and don't like. But
And the orphan or the fatherless is without guidance. And I think that's a big part of this. The psalmist is looking for, help me, God, this is what I think needs to happen. This is what I think you ought to do, but help me, I'm praying to you for your intervention. He's wanting that father. He's wanting that help, that guidance.
Yeah, I think that certainly gets to it too. And as I'm running over my time, I apologize to everybody for being a little long. I think that one of the big things, that this is something as well that is a little bit cultural, that it does take a little bit in of the breadwinner idea, or that within their context specifically, being without a father was a serious detriment. And it is now too, though perhaps in different ways. But without someone who was the head of a household for them at that time, you were defenseless in a lot of ways that you would not be today as well, right? Legally, right? Within the realm of law and the courts and so forth, someone without a male head of household would have to suffer and have fewer rights and privileges. There would not be the person responsible for defending them is absent. Right? This idea simply takes it in perhaps a bigger sense than we immediately grasp from our own context, how vulnerable this person is. It is speaking of the vulnerability of various kinds of people in various ways, those that are going to be preyed upon by the wicked. All right, I am definitely over. We have small children coming in here. Any final thoughts, comments that just cannot wait? Because I don't want to leave anybody with that pearl of wisdom that unspoken. All right, well, you've been very patient with me running long. We will move on and talk about Psalm 11 next week. Thank you very much.